Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest back on. Actually, it's just him today. Usually I have him and Zach on, but Josh Pelland, he is a co-owner at Data Driven Strength. He also has his master's degree in exercise science and is a certified strength and conditioning specialist. And he is currently a research assistant at Florida Atlanta University Muscle Physiology Laboratory. Man, that was a lot. I don't know why, but Josh, thanks for coming on, man. Looking forward to chatting with you. And like I said, this is the first time I've had just you on. It's usually you and Zach. But again, appreciate you taking time on your day to hop back on here again.
Hey, it's a pleasure, man. Hopefully I don't fumble too bad without my partner in crime, but we'll see how I do.
Without the sidekick. And one
Yeah,
thing I
exactly.
also forgot to mention is you're currently pursuing your PhD. And on Instagram, you're looking at training volume. I'm curious to hear about that. Is that kind of like the main thing that you're looking at? Is there anything specific that you're looking at with training volume?
Yeah, that's the limited character edition. So from like a high level, that's what I'm interested in is training dosage. So just trying to better understand the nature of the relationship between dosage, which is typically quantified with weekly set numbers, so training volume, and its relationship on hypertrophy and strength specifically. So that's kind of part of my PhD. Another part of my PhD is related to that dosage or to that volume, but more specifically, how skeletal muscle, which is just a fancy way of saying the muscles we train in the gym, how that muscle might resensitize to a given volume or a given dosage of training. So it's two parts. I'd say I'm most of the way through part one and about to start part two relatively soon through a few projects. But yeah, from a high level, it's training volume or training dosage, but also how muscle might resensitize to a given dosage.
Cool. Yeah. Two things that I love chatting about and super interested in. I know volume's a hot topic right now. So where are you right now with that? Yeah. Where are you at with that right now when it comes to volume for hypertrophy specifically?
Yeah, I can't spill the beans too much. And I think if you would have asked me at the beginning of the year when I would have hoped to have had this out in some capacity, I would have hoped it would have been out by now. But we have what I would like to think is a new, updated, and improved analysis of the effects of volume on hype and strength outcomes. And also baked within that project is also basically a meta-analysis on frequency as well. So we do have some insights. We are done with the analysis. We're writing it right now. As I was talking before we pressed record here, we just finished up data collection for the semester, and teaching is coming to a halt as well for the semester. So hopefully that'll be out as soon as possible. But we do have some insights from that have been an important first step in informing that second part that I mentioned regarding resensitization. What I'll say is I think it's surprising that there might not be like this clear plateau that we initially thought. Secondly, and shout out to Zach, who we mentioned, who's basically my business partner and also colleague in our lab. His dissertation is on individual differences in training outcomes and trying to better understand and contextualize some of the spread of data we see in the average resistance training study, right? If someone pulls up a paper that looked at hypertrophy or strength gains, you're going to see a wide distribution of that. So anyway, if you put those two concepts together, I think a while ago, and when I say a while, maybe 12, 18 months ago, I would have thought that each individual has a volume sweet spot from a physiological perspective that they need to find for themselves. And I think practically that might be the case, but I'm starting to question the physiological nature of that. And in other words, I think in a lot of ways, more is better. I think harder is better. And I think a lot of the things that might give this phenomenon of a sweet spot to training volume or to proximity to failure or to exercise selection, a lot of these things are practical in nature. And that's where I'm at with it right now is the role of research is to better inform the nature of the dose response relationship or lack thereof between two variables. And it seems pretty strong for volume is what I'll say for now. And I think the decisions you make in terms of where you fall is going to be largely practical in terms of how much you can net over a longer period of time, right? Because that's something that can get overlooked when thinking about resistance training research is it's basically adherence controlled, right? In the sense that the only way you get a post-testing outcome is if the individual made it through the study. I'm not saying that there are like a ton of dropouts, but what humans can do when they're pushed hard by researchers in a lab or an in-person coach for a relatively short period of time and sustain it and stay healthy and get to the end of that and benefit from it, I think might be higher than we previously thought. Now, that doesn't mean we need to go to these extremes all the time in practice, but I'm opening my mind up or shifting my mind in terms of what's capable to benefit from in the short term. And that kind of informs the long-term perspective in the sense that the goal is probably to get as much work in as you can. That's where I'm at right now over a certain period of time.
Yeah. So it sounds, because I know for a while it was like, hey, you don't want to do too much, because if you do too much, you're just not going to be able to recover from it. But from what it sounds like, you're starting to lean towards the point of it's probably a good idea to try and get in as much as you can potentially that's practical for you, right? If you can. And I'm sure
Yeah.
there's other like limitations to that and whatnot. But is that kind of sum that up correctly there?
Yeah, it's almost like working backwards as opposed to working forwards, if that makes sense. So when I say working backwards, it's ideally we do a lot and we do it really hard, and you center your life around training. Honestly, I think that's probably the starting point, but you need to work back from that. And I simultaneously hold that to be true, but I also, from a practical perspective, find a lot of success with relatively low volumes, right? Like right now, pretty busy, get pretty stressed out at times. I have multiple muscles on 4 to 6 sets a week. And is it ideal? Is it perfect? No. But I think it's sufficient to get to move in the right direction. So there's a big difference between ideal and some gains, right? Maximal gains versus some gains. So it's not a binary thing. But yeah, in short, I think what you said is where my head is at right now. Granted, things are always shifting, and I wouldn't be surprised if things change a year or two from now. But I'd say that's the biggest shift in my mindset is that working backwards approach versus working forward approach towards like this theoretical optimal dosage for the individual. I think it's largely practical more than anything.
And practical being just like what you can commit to, like the time that you have, sleep, all is that kind of what you mean there by that?
Yeah, I think it goes a little bit deeper than that too. I think time is one thing. I also think energy is a big thing. And I know this kind of seems like hand wavy or a little bit woo, but if your ability to train hard consistently at a given dosage is unsustainable, it might not be like a true time thing, but instead might be more so like an almost like an energy, a daily energy management sort of thing.
Yeah.
If I'm training for 60 minutes, I could probably get in more volume than I'm actually doing right now, but what's the quality of that volume going to be? And to what degree am I going to sustain some training approach where the goal is just to pack in as much work as possible, but instead ensure the quality and the sustainability is there and the psychological approach and just feeling good feelings toward training and looking forward to it. I think that's a big part of it as well. And I think that kind of informs a lot of things in practice, right? Like exercise selection as well, which is having its time right now in the community is, and I think that's for good reason. But I think a lot of these principles or discussions are secondary to a lot of practical things, like what is the individual going to be really excited about progressing on? If they're fired up about going from 6 plates to 8 plates per side on the leg press compared to going from halfway down the stack to 3/4 down the stack on, I don't know, some other machine, then that's going to matter a lot more than some of these smaller things, if you will. I view it less in terms of kind of this defined time availability, but more so from like a what is this individual just going to pour themselves into, look forward to, and execute with a very high level of intent. Because I think that creates the foundation before we even get to these discussions about things like the dosage of training.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What are they like? Yeah, do they even feel about going into it? Can you hear me? Good on that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you cut out
It's a,
there for a second, but no, you're
okay.
good.
I moved my mic. But yeah, like what is the person willing to actually put into it? And that's super important, right? Because like we could sit here and be
Hmm.
like, hey, you could do all this volume, but if they don't want to put the time and effort in, or the effort into doing it, it's like you
Hmm.
said, it's not for anything there at that point. So that's like a super important thing to look at as well too there with that.
Yeah, and I think last time we were on, maybe one of your questions was like, would you use barbell lifts for hypertrophy? And my answer is on paper, no, but in practice, yes, quite a bit. Now, I probably have a biased sample because if I think of my client roster, the folks that are focused on hypertrophy either are doing it temporarily because their larger goal is powerlifting related, or they were powerlifters and they've shifted towards hypertrophy, so they still have that side of them. But like some people just get really fired up about progressing their high bar squat 8RM compared to going in for to try to progress their pendulum squat, right? And there's no right or wrong answer there. It's not going to be unanimous across the board. Maybe another individual could care less about their high bar squat, but really cares about their pendulum squat. But I think the excitement and intent for training is something I'm thinking about way more as a coach than I'm thinking about these ideal manipulations of various biomechanics and muscle lengths and 100% optimized dosages to maximize progress over 10 weeks. To me, a lot of this stuff is secondary to the bedrock of being flexible within, again, just the energy and intent that is put into the plan.
Yeah, because like you said, if that's not there, it's just going to be like you said, if you're like, hey, we got to progress pendulums, but if somebody hates it, it's like they're not going to be able to put everything into it. So no matter what you give them for that, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Now, I think some of it is, I'm sure some of this is you do need, not everybody's going to love training, but again, if you really want to see the results that you want to see, it's like there does kind of need to be that enjoyment aspect of it to allow you to push to higher levels and to
Yeah.
consistently do that. Because if not, it's just going to be a challenge no matter what there with that. So
Yeah, I had this personally when I was training pretty hard for powerlifting for 2 or 3 years straight, where that was more or less the number one focus. And then largely to save time, I shifted to just almost exclusively hypertrophy training. So really no more barbell squats, barbell RDLs, but not like a sumo deadlift, really no more barbell bench either. And I noticed I was fine and I still had the habit of going to the gym and training hard. But when I was training for powerlift, I would think and get anxious about what am I going to hit for my single or my top triple the next day, which I think a lot of people might hear that and think that's a negative thing. I think that's an absolutely beautiful thing of like waking up and tossing and turning in the middle of the night before a big deadlift session. Yeah, is that ideal from that night of sleep perspective? No, but that shows you care about it a lot. And I think that had a lot of downstream benefits in terms of I was probably a little bit stricter about going to bed on time because I knew I wanted to perform well the next morning, or making sure that the meal I had or the meals I had the day before were ideal so that I was digestion was in a good spot and I was the appropriate amount of powerlifting bloat for the next day. Whereas the flexibility that comes with hypertrophy training, I think, is a blessing and a curse
yep.
because it's really nice. It's given me a lot of flexibility. Training has less of a footprint on my life right now, which it needs to, but I don't think I'm maximizing my progress by any means right now. And I think if I were to center my life around it, I'd have some power lifts in there because I know that it chasing numbers really gets me fired up. And that's unique to me. That's not right or wrong, but I think that's undervalued by a lot of folks.
Yeah, I tried to make this point before where it's and this is basically what you're hitting on here. It's we talk about hey the optimal amount of volume, the like how close you need to train to failure, but it's like the one variable that people do forget is like what do you enjoy and what are you actually going to stick with? And
Mm-hmm.
like you said there, I think that is a cool thing with hypertrophy. Like you said, it is probably a blessing in disguise, but I do feel like that's probably the at least what I've picked up over the last couple of years with hypertrophy is we do have a lot of tools in the toolbox and there is a lot of variety that you can not variety. Yeah, I guess variety, but there are different ways to get to where you want to go and
Mm-hmm.
finding what you enjoy best is going to be part of that journey and everything like that.
Yeah. And another thing I've really internalized recently is that ultimately, and I'm biased here because like we talked about the focus over the last year and going forward as I finish my PhD, hopefully, the focus is on the dosage of training and trying to better understand that, both from an absolute perspective and from a relative perspective in terms of the potential resensitization effects. To me, that is what we really care about in order to maximize or the yeah having the potential to maximize progress, because when you think about other training variables, really what you're looking at is efficiency. Because if you're looking at a rest period study, or you're looking at a rep range study, or you're looking at a proximity to failure study, typically what you do is you control for the number of sets that are done. Obviously, there are some designs that are a little bit different but for the most part, that's the gold standard design right now is say, okay, we're going to have one group trained with sets of 3 and one group trained with sets of 8. And from other research, we know that the triples are probably going to be a little bit less hypertrophic per set. But ultimately, that's an efficiency question, right? And there's no reason to believe that you can't get back to baseline or get back or match that other group with additional sets, right? Same idea with the muscling stuff. Most of the time, it is controlled for the number of sets, and training with muscles that kind of bias a longer length or potentially even lengthen partials seems to be a little bit more efficient per set. But I think, unfortunately, you can't make assumptions about what that does to like your max rate of progress. So I think that's really important from a practical perspective too. This is a very casual term, and I hope it's not offensive, but some people are like exercise junkies and they just like to move and push really hard and be sweating and be out of breath. And they might enjoy like short rest period training a lot. And that probably isn't quite as efficient on a per set basis. but who's to say that they can't just double their volume and get a similar total amount? So that's why I'm really interested in this dosage concept, which is not a new concept by any means, but I think there's as the field progresses, there's more and more to look at and better statistical tools to get insights and just higher quality research that needs to be done, et cetera. That's where I'm at with training right now. And it's quite different than probably where I was last time I was on the show. And I'm sure it'll continue to evolve.
Yep, that's part of it, right? And being a researcher
Mhm.
like that, you're always going to evolve, and as you should, right? I think if you don't, then we would be wondering what you're doing there with that.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing. I mean, I think this kind of is on somewhat of the same topic, and I know I've heard you talk about this in the past, and I've talked to Brian Borstein about it as well too. And this is the kind of concept of specialization phases, and I feel like some of this is coming from maybe some of the volume research that you've looked into, and maybe that you're doing now. But if you don't mind, maybe just hitting on what they are, and then maybe hit on your rationale and maybe some research into why you think maybe these could be beneficial there.
Yeah. So I'll start with defining what they are for the listener, just to make sure they understand what the goal of a specialization phase would be in the first place. So the idea is just that you're specializing one or multiple muscle groups. I'd say 1 to 4 is probably good, with 2 or 3 being the sweet spot. And I'd say the two main levers that you pull to specialize muscle groups singular or muscle groups plural would be putting them as early as possible in the session, which honestly doesn't have direct research supporting it, but there might be a little bit of a benefit there in terms of moving it up in the session. And secondly, giving it a lot of love from a dosage perspective in terms of training volume. And that's maybe the reason they've been discussed a little bit more recently is because, like I mentioned, I think a lot of people are getting this inclination from the research that, yes, there are some studies that don't show a benefit to higher volumes, but on balance, there doesn't seem to be this clear plateau. And I think we can say with a pretty high degree of confidence, there's no clear point at which gains start to become worse with additional volume, right? So there's no kind of clear downward turn of that theoretical inverted U with volume for hypertrophy. So the idea being, okay, if more is better and just more focus is better, and I really want to grow a weak muscle group or just a muscle group I care about growing, I'm going to specialize it. So the research underlying that is, again, the volume research in general, and then potential, I guess I would put this in kind of the speculative category, are some studies that look at this concept of skeletal muscle memory, or in other words, basically an accelerated rate of adaptations following a period of detraining. So there are some, the exact mechanisms are not entirely clear, but it seems to be some combination of retained myonuclei, which are basically just the nuclei in skeletal muscle that seems to be necessary for the processes that allow for hypertrophy to occur. So, in other words, if I push volume really high in a given muscle and it grows a lot, and then I take a little bit of a break from it, and then I push it again, it might have an amplified response to training than it originally did because it's regaining lost ground. And secondly, is some epigenetic factors. Basically, you can think of it as the muscle kind of remembering its previous stimuli and thus, again, expediting the process of getting back to its peak. And then from a practical perspective, there are some studies that kind of do things that resemble volume cycling. There's not a ton, but there are a handful. For example, there's a study, I think it's 2013, from a group, I think they're in Japan. The lead author is Ogasawara. Basically, one group trained for 24 weeks continuously, and the other group also was measured at the beginning and at week 24, but they took 2 3-week breaks across those 24 weeks. So, in other words, one group trained for 24 weeks, the other group took 6 weeks off intermittently throughout that 24 weeks.
At
And
one
what you
time
see,
or randomly, you said throughout that.
so it was basically 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off,
Okay.
6 weeks on. Yeah. And they took hypertrophy measures basically at 0 weeks, at 6 weeks, at 9 weeks, at I think 15 weeks, 18 weeks, and then 24 weeks. You can see how it responded to taking some time off. And to start with that group that trained continuously, as you would expect, across all those time points, you see diminishing returns, right? So they actually have this really nice plot in the paper where they show the average weekly gain in muscle mass through these different kind of like parts of the training intervention. So don't quote me on these numbers, but just to paint the picture, The first period, they saw an average of 4% gain per week. And then it went to 3% for kind of the next period of training, then 2%, then 1%. So that's what you would expect, right? If someone starts training, because these folks were untrained, they see a lot of progress at first, and then it's still substantial, but it tapers off. What you saw in the continuous group was really good progress, just like the other group for the first 6 weeks, because they were doing the exact same training. Then from week 6 to 9, their first break from training, they lost muscle. Okay. But then from basically the 6 weeks of training after that detraining period, they saw the same gains compared to that initial period. Same idea for that last 6 week period. So in other words, if you look at those 3 6 week training blocks, the average gain was the same. Now, the big limitation here is that they lost muscle, right? And I think anyone listening to this isn't really interested in losing muscle. And ultimately, what we see is that by the end of those 24 weeks, both groups were at similar levels of muscle mass, or in other words, they both gained similar amounts. The group that kind of cycled volume saw more efficient results, but at the end of the day, they didn't see better results. Okay, that's interesting. I can take a week off for vacation, probably not a huge deal. I really want to maximize my gains. What's the potential benefit here? And that's where I'm very interested in understanding what's required for this kind of effect. Because in that Ogasawara study I just walked through, as well as a couple others, what from a recent period that indicates that resensitization occurs. So in other words, the muscle is more sensitive to the training stimulus and saw a really robust response. That has occurred after a period of losing muscle, of complete detraining. So what I'm interested in, and this is, I think, very practical for folks looking to use specialization phases, is can we elicit resensitization after a maintenance period? If that's the case, then one of two things, and potentially both are possible. One is that we can get a similar efficiency bump like that Ogasawara study without having periods where you're smaller because muscle decreased. And or you could potentially, there's rationale to think that this kind of resensitization effect could amplify progress after the maintenance period and potentially have net greater effects over time. So that's the muscle physiology explanation and rate of gains explanation that I'm very interested in. And to me, that's the role of research, is to understand how human physiology works and how skeletal muscle responds to a given stimulus and how that might change based on, in this case, previous training. And that's super interesting. But I'm really bullish on specialization phases, even if what I just talked through and this whole maintenance thing doesn't elicit resensitization, because I think it's a really good practical tool. Even if resensitization without a decrease in muscle size isn't a thing, I think it's just a really good way to program for hypertrophy because of the volume research in general. And then I think it's just unpractical to maximize everything all at once. And I also think it's really enjoyable to have different focuses. I've never really enjoyed back training. I don't dislike it. It's just I've never really had issues growing my back. It's fine. But I had specialized basically everything else in my upper body over the period of probably 7 or 8 months. And then I was like, man, specializing my back sounds awesome right now. And it's just a nice way to keep things fresh for hypertrophy, because sometimes it can get a little bit stale. Yep. And again, from a practical perspective, because there's no clear kind of downward turn of the inverted U, I think it makes a lot of sense, so long as you're maintaining in kind of the muscles that are not specialized. And a lot of times you can give them enough volume so that they're still growing, maybe just not at quite as fast of a pace. So I think there's a very interesting physiological rationale that I think can probably lead this approach, this volume cycling approach, to lead to similar results and potentially even slightly better results. But then from a practical perspective, I think it's the way to go for a lot of folks, especially once they start to have preferences in terms of what to grow, and or maybe have difficulty growing certain muscles, those sorts of things.
Yeah, no, that you bring up some good points there. I like the practical side of things too. I have thought of that, but you definitely, that's something I forgot about, where it's like, again, this kind of goes back to what we talked about initially with, like you said, we want to try to do as much as we can, but again, if we're not into it, you're not going to put all of it into it. So if you can have this almost, I guess it would be somewhat of a periodized approach, essentially, where you do change things up. Like, even if there isn't necessarily a physiological benefit from it. It's like mentally, it could be something that keeps you fresh and like wanting to actually push, which in turn is going to have a ton of benefit there with that. And then on top of it, we have this potential resensitization aspect of it too that you say may play out as well too. What does that look like?
Mhm.
Again, do you necessarily like maybe you don't have to lose muscle, maybe you can just go to maintenance and you can still see that effect, but you don't know for sure on that. But that could be another added benefit there to that. So again, it's not only
Mhm.
like a physiological side of things; it's also a mental side of things where you could see that these play a role as well too there.
Yeah, and I think everyone is time limited. Like even, and Jeff, you might be able to vouch for this as well. If you disagree, I'd also be interested. But even the clients that are like, I'll do anything, right? Like I'll train, like I have up to 3 hours a day and I can train any day of the week. Very rarely do I think they're actually going to train hard 20 hours a week with a lot of intent and focus, even if they're the sort of person that's like kind of a maximalist. I think hard decisions are inevitable when it comes to programming. And I think this is a nice framework to make a lot of those decisions more seamless. Hey, is there anything you want to focus on in the upcoming block? Or obviously, if you're working with someone that's interested in physique sports, then part of the role of the coach is to assess weak points, right? But for a more everyday lifter sort of person, they're going to have preferences, right? And I think that's cool. And ultimately, hypertrophy training is to look better, and people are going to have areas they care about more. And I think, again, specialization is a great way to lean into that and enhance enjoyment a bit. I also think there are other practical implications of this, specifically related to deloads. Now, again, a lot of the resensitization effects we see in the research are longer than just the typical deload length, which is typically 1 week in practice. But I think there's still a lot to be learned there. We have really only one study on deloads. And depending on how you look at it, you could frame it as a win for resensitization or a win for don't worry about it. Also, when you take a step back, specifically with that study, one group did 16 sessions. The other group did, I think, 18 sessions. I'm not surprised there wasn't a huge difference between groups because basically that study found no differences between a group that took a week off halfway through versus a group that trained for 9 weeks straight. So I think there's a lot to be learned on deloads, is what I'm saying. I think that study from Max Coleman and the good folks over at Layman was a fantastic way to kick off the research, but I think we have a lot to learn regarding deloads. And then I also think if resensitization really is a thing, and we learn a lot over the next handful of years from a muscle physiology perspective, I think you could even make the case for some kind of week to week set addition models being better than more of a constant approach. Now, there are some additional questions to answer there, but it might be this as opposed to static target in terms of what you benefit from. It's a moving target, right? So as you adapt to a given training stimulus, maybe to continue to see similar rate of progress, you need to add more to keep up with it and then deload to reset it. I doubt that's the case, but it's certainly possible. So yeah, I think I'm bullish on it for the folks that care enough and are interested enough in this stuff to worry about some of the minutia. I'm also very happy saying that most people don't have to worry about this. And a balanced program without deloads and going on vacation twice a year and keeping it chill from a training perspective is a totally fine way to go as well for hypertrophy. So I don't think it needs to be overcomplicated, but I think for someone like you, Jeff, I think you mentioned Brian Bornstein, like you guys are going to play around with it and see if it elicits benefits for yourself or for clients that are really invested. And then it also can allow people to lean into the muscles they really care about growing, I think is another big part of it as well.
Yep, and again, goes back to the enjoyment of training. Like for me, for example, I'm just like any bro. I'm not a huge fan of training legs. That's always been my like the least favorite muscle group to train. But luckily for me, it's also a muscle group that I don't need a ton of volume for. So it's like kind of the
Mhm.
both of those kind of come together, and I can utilize that to where I don't necessarily need to do as much volume there, and that frees up a lot of space to do specialization cycles for back or upper body that I enjoy training, and it adds more
Mhm.
enjoyment into training. And I think it even if you're somebody who doesn't like training, this could be a good thing to add in. But for somebody like me that does love training, but I've been doing it for a while, it's like this can add in that nice little like freshness to it as well too, and keep it enjoyable. I think that's a huge benefit. So a couple questions on it. You hit on, hey, I think it's totally fine that you could just do like you said, just train throughout the year, take a couple vacations, you're good to go, and keep everything the same. So would this be like anything that a beginner would use, or would you be like, hey, you probably do need to train everything pretty evenly to start out, or when would you like potentially incorporate this into somebody's program, or could it be something that you could do right off the bat?
Yeah, I don't see any reason that training status has to play a big role here, to be honest. At the end of the day, resistance training for physique enhancement is inherently a preference-based thing, right? You're
Yeah.
saying I prefer to look as I think I will with larger muscles, right? And if that's the case, it's up to you what muscles you want to prioritize. And I see no reason why a rank beginner can't have an unbalanced program in the sense that they're biasing muscles they care more about growing. Now, I think like the role of the coach would be to inform someone the benefits of also training their lower body, right? I think as long as you're doing some training, that's going to go a long way to make sure that they're getting some of the health benefits or the musculoskeletal benefits for things like aging or disease risk reduction. But beyond that, man, I think anyone can do it. And I don't think we need to have any barriers on that front.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense, right? Like you said, just as a coach, like if you're working with a coach, it's hey, just inform them the potential trade-offs of doing that, or hey, if we're not going to train something, like here's the potential drawback of it. But there's also a lot of pros to it. So again, training status won't be something that really matters there with that. And two, as I asked that question, I'm thinking we probably already do this in a way, right? When we program for people. Like, for example, one right off the bat would be men versus women, right? So you're probably going to specialize a little bit when you do their programs as well. Generally, women's going to be maybe a little bit more lower body, maybe a little bit more glute focused or have a little bit more glutes in there. Whereas men, it's going to be maybe a little bit more upper body, maybe a little bit more like chest exercises and stuff. So we already like do this without really thinking about it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you can lean into that a lot. And it seems relatively simple. Like this discussion seems relatively simple. Hey, you care more about something, do more of it. But it's funny how I've come to this position because again, I think my answer would have been a little bit more complex previously. Maybe not a misunderstanding of previous research, but maybe just better contextualizing previous research. Again, using a combination of the work up to this point in my PhD as well as Zach's PhD research that I think is going to be really insightful as he gets more of it out there. Because again, before I might have said, yeah, that's true, but you really want to make sure you find, okay, maybe guys on average want to train their arms more. You really want to find that sweet spot for bicep training volume for that individual. I think a lot of these things are going to be pretty apparent, like just from training, right? Yeah, if you're getting weaker over time, doing so much, or it's getting to the point where it's impacting your sleep or you're irritable, right? These are obvious signs that you're doing too much of something. But beyond that, man, I think more is going to be better. That's surprisingly controversial for some folks, but I'm also going to follow that up by saying for myself and for clients, program, like I said before, 4 to 6 sets a week at times. And I think that can lead to really awesome muscle growth. And I think the differences here are relatively small, but definitely meaningful. And it makes me happy because it's like a choose your own adventure approach. And I think that's a little bit more freeing than maybe trying to be overly precise in the past with kind of my previous thinking about training.
Yeah, and I think when we say like more is better, again, we're also saying that again that effort needs to be there, right? Like you could just do a ton of set volume and it's you're 10 reps away from failure. It's okay. We could probably be a little bit more efficient with that, finding that combination for you. So you mentioned that we want to like the two main things you can do here are you want to train it as early as possible in a session, which I'm surprised there's not much research on that training something first. Would it maybe be like, would that maybe be some like indirect kind of like research there where it's not necessarily like we're trying to find this, but it's like when you do some studies that kind of you indirectly find that. So I'd be curious here about that. But then you also said more volume. Those are like the two main things there with that. And I guess my question is, I know something you hit on here throughout, but should it be a slower progression with increasing volume or should it be a ramp up right away? And then maybe if you want to hit on the training early as possible too, that I mentioned there.
Yeah. So that's a good question about exercise order. There isn't a ton of research, but there is some. And for strength, it does seem to confer a benefit. So if I'm going to squat and bench in the same session and I do squat first, probably over a long enough time period, I'm going to see slightly better strength gains in my squat compared to the bench press. But for hypertrophy, there isn't a clear effect. And I think there's a lot of things that fall in the category of neutral to positive. There's really no downside to, at least in most kind of common sense cases, of doing something first that you are biasing, right? There's other things that are neutral positive in terms of benefits, but could come at a cost, either monetarily or time-wise. Think of a lot of common supplements. Whereas in the case of exercise order, it's like there might be a slight benefit, even if it doesn't show up in the research. There's really no downside. And if you do notice a downside, then it's not something to worry about a ton. And the final thing I'll say on that is you also have, when you're interpreting research and just research in general, keep in mind the environment that these sort of training studies are being done in, right? If I go walk into the gym, I'm a human being and I would love for my focus and intent to be a 10 out of 10 at all times, but it's not, right? But if I go into the lab, I can definitely be having a bad day, but that'll get smoothed out a little bit by having researchers around me pushing me throughout the entire session. And that could be a reason we're not seeing a benefit to exercises done earlier in a session for
Mm.
in a lab setting is because the researchers are providing that cushion and ensuring higher effort later in the session. I think a similar thing could be said for RPE rating accuracy. My current opinion is that under some basic conditions, like most people are really good at it, but that's with the caveat that most of the time these participants know that we are examining their accuracy in assessing how many reps they have left, and their effort is very high. The verbal encouragement is very high. So that might not be an apples to apples comparison when thinking about a gym setting. But don't get me wrong, I think RAR is spot on for a lot of advanced trainees with sufficient feedback over time. And then in terms of your question of a slow versus a ramping approach, there is very little direct research on this. I think that from a practical perspective, I see no reason not to do a ramping approach in the sense that, okay, you're at your previous volumes, either coming off of a deload and you're getting back and you're getting to the peak volume for the next training phase for a given muscle. I see no clear benefit of doing kind of the stepwise increase. I think that has a higher likelihood of increasing some aches and pains for some folks. I think muscle damage has been written off too early, to be honest, in terms of contributing to muscle growth. But I do think it checks out conceptually that a very high degree of muscle damage is probably not what you want. And if you go from 6 sets a week during kind of a lower volume phase directly into 20 sets for your specialization phase, depending on the muscle damage is going to be quite high. And I think that's where you just run into things kind of the block fizzling out because of an ache or a pain, or you get some of those overreaching symptoms earlier, that sort of thing. And I can't think of a good rationale for a stepwise increase over a ramping increase. I say that, but at the same time, my current design for an upcoming training study looking at volume cycling is a stepwise increase because with research, you basically want to look at the extremes before you look at more practical versions of it. So for the for the 0 to 1 people that might be very astute and think back to this conversation when my dissertation research is published in 2 or 3 years, when they're like, hey, I thought you said stepwise increases don't make a lot of sense. There's a reason from a research perspective, or from a practical perspective, I would lean into a ramping approach. It doesn't have to be super slow, but I think at least 1 or 2 kind of steps up to a higher volume. I see little downside to that.
Yeah, and from my understanding too, if you go from a lower volume to higher volume, that's where, like you said there, like one, the muscle damage, but then like you said, to make some pains. And I think like from what I remember hearing, like anytime you do a huge increase in volume like that, it also, and this goes back to the aches and pains, like injury risk can potentially increase as well too. So it's, hey, it makes more sense maybe to have that more step fashion plus, or not step fashion, ramping up. Which again, it probably also makes sense too, because you may find that maybe you can get away with doing a little less than you initially thought as well too, versus, oh, I overshot it, now I got to go under, versus, okay, let's slowly work up. Maybe it's a little bit, maybe I can get away with a little less than I thought as well too, if you take that ramp up approach.
Yeah, it can be a little bit of a course correction, right? Again, we can say that, hey, all things held equal, more is better, but also like in practice, not everything is held equally, right? And if your plan is to specialize your pecs and you want to push it up to 24 sets a week and you've been doing 12 sets a week, first of all, that's just a really big increase. And second of all, okay, you really want to do that? Let's at least take our time getting up there. And you might have some second thoughts on the way up there. So I think that's a very good point, right? Like I can't even imagine doing 24 sets on my pecs. Like to me, specialization on pecs is like 12 to 14. And now I have some pretty high level bench pressers that bench press up to 6 days a week and do at times well over 20 sets, sometimes even getting into the 30s. So I think it's possible, but like for the point I'm making is for me, I would crash and burn with some volumes that other people do that might be good on paper and you're super gung ho about specialization. It's like just make sure that's something that you can actually sustain and don't run into overreaching symptoms and can still apply a lot of effort to all of your training, let alone the sets you're actually doing on that muscle.
What about in terms of like how long? Would it just be a typical mesocycle? Is it like multiple mesocycle? I know that also it's okay, how long are your mesocycles? So is there like a time frame on this, or is time not necessarily anything that we need to be focused on here with this?
I don't think there's any hard or fast rule here. I can tell you what I lean towards in practice. I'll specialize a muscle for up to 3 mesocycles in a row. And then after that, it's like, all right, any potential, like from the physiological side, we're talking about any potential like resensitization effects that we had going into this, those are probably
They're
long
gone.
gone by now. But again, from a practical perspective, like you can still do it. If your no, if your number one priority in life is getting 19-inch arms, then like you should probably specialize damn near all the time. And if you want to take a little bit of time each year at maintenance volumes, chilling out a little bit, like that's fine. And that can be these kind of reset phases. But yeah, I don't have any strong constraints for time from a practical perspective. If we learn more about these resensitization effects, we might have some more kind of input regarding things on the time front. But for now, I'd lean into a lot of those practical things. And again, I find myself going 1 to 3 mesocycles, focusing on a given muscle or muscles, and then shifting it from there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Again, it just ultimately comes down to how are you feeling, and like you said, there's no like hard set rule of this. Probably practically speaking, once you get 3 mesocycles, we're probably talking what, like 6 to 10 weeks of that, like per mesocycle is probably okay. Yeah, you're probably any benefit from there at that point. You probably maxed out from like a resensitization standpoint. But again, you still have that option there with that. That's what we did. I think I did 2 mesocycles for one, and now we switched. I felt like that was pretty good from like a enjoyment standpoint, injury
Mhm.
management standpoint, and all that as well too. So, would there be any downsides to doing a specialization phase in your mind? Is there anything that you can think of from that standpoint?
Complexity, which I think is not something to overlook, right? Job as a coach is to take that complexity onto my plate and deal with it for the individual. So that's a luxury if you have a coach. But if you're interested in this, I think there's pretty easy ways to play around with it. But I do think that complexity can be a downside. Beyond that, so long as you're not dropping your volumes super low in kind of these lower volume phases that are theoretically going to resensitize the muscle, I don't really see any clear downsides based on our current understanding right now. I think you could, jumping off of the complexity side of things, I think you could butcher it to the point where a given muscle is just accidentally on maintenance for a super long time if it's not one that you ever specialize. So that's why, honestly, like my kind of practical approach is give everything a good amount of love, give everything a good dosage that you think is going to grow and that you would do otherwise if you were just taking kind of a stock standard hypertrophy training approach without any volume cycling or specialization. And then just, yeah, give a little bit more kind of priority and a little bit more volume to what you want to specialize, put them earlier in sessions, maybe increase frequency slightly. But the biggest downside I could see is if you're like, oh, yeah, I'm going to have my 6 weeks of bicep specialization in December. So like right now they're on maintenance. It's, no, dude, you're just going to not grow your biceps and maybe get a little bit more growth in December. So I think again that complexity could lead to some people butchering it, but I think if done properly, I see it largely from an outcome perspective as a neutral to positive over the long term.
Gotcha. Yeah. Again, like just that extra layer of complexity there can make things challenging there. Cool. Awesome, man. We're coming up to the top of the hour here. I want to be respectful of your time and everything. And I guess before I let you go, are there any new studies that have come out on your end in the last couple months? And then maybe if you could, I know you hit on one that you're going to be potentially working on. Is there anything from that standpoint coming out soon that you're excited for yourself, or maybe just something that you guys are working on at your lab and stuff like that too?
Earlier this week, as of recording it, we had a concurrent training study published.
Oh, no.
It's titled "The Effective Time Equated Concurrent Training Programs in Resistance Trained Men." Lead author on that is Chad Dolan, who is from a previous generation of the Muscle Lab here at Florida Atlantic. So it's a collaboration between current students and previous students that are moved on to do really cool things. So that's finally out. And then we have a good amount of things in the pipeline, to be honest. I'll just mention again, Zach, he's working on, we actually, as of 48 hours ago, finished his dissertation research, which was like a 2 year long study. So he's working on analyzing that. Jake Remmert's working on some volume auto-regulation research right now. He's also prepping for a bodybuilding show and doing a case study on himself. He's doing some really cool stuff there. I mentioned some of the projects I'm working on right now, including volume meta-analysis for hypertrophy and strength, as well as a frequency meta-analysis. we'll start that volume cycling study hopefully pretty soon. We have a muscle length paper in the works and also looking at some alternative set structures probably later this year in a study. So we have a lot. It is frustratingly slow how long all this stuff takes, but all those things I mentioned will see the light of day. And if you want a little something in the meantime, you can check out that concurrent training paper.
Awesome. Yeah. What was Zach's? Is it around training to like failure, intensity of training, or is that kind of what that
So,
was around?
so Zach's dissertation is basically around individual differences in training outcomes. So
Gotcha.
trying
That's
to
right.
understand statistically what we can say and what we cannot say regarding differential responses to training, and also what might predict those responses, differential responses to training. So I think he's going to have some really important things to say on that. And it's been really cool kind of being alongside him over the last handful of years, now that he's coming up near the end of his kind of PhD timeframe, and see how much he's learned, how much I've learned as a result of that, and honestly, how important from a practical perspective a lot of these things are. I think it's going to be really exciting just from a discussion standpoint and pushing the field forward. So he's been quiet on it because he's the kind of guy that wants to make sure he has his ducks in a row before he opens his mouth on something. But I'm really excited for it in general and very excited for him because I've learned a lot just through his process. And I know he's learned probably twice as much as I have.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's super cool. You guys are busy. You got a lot going on there. So that's cool. Looking forward to all this. Your volume analysis, when are you thinking that will be? Any idea, or is that too hard to say?
It's like I mentioned on the front end, I was hoping for well before April of 2024. We're basically done with the analysis and I have a good amount of it written. So soon is what I'll say. Soon
Soon.
is what I'll
Okay.
say. I don't want to make any promises, but soon.
That's all you can give us, right? Just soon. It will be
Yeah.
here soon. I feel like that will be one that I feel will be all over social media just because I feel like volume and hypertrophy, man, that's like one of those hot topics. Length and partial, stuff like that. Like volume's one that just people just ask about all the time.
Yep. It comes back every couple years.
So that'll be cool. Looking forward to that. Josh, appreciate your time, man. As always, we'll have to get you on here again soon. And yeah, I guess before I let you go, I almost forgot this. Anywhere where you want to lead the audience to or anything like that?
You could just go to my Instagram is probably the easiest place to check out my link tree. So my Instagram handle is Josh. Check out the link tree there, see all our stuff. I also think my research gate is link there, so you can check out some of our previous work.
Awesome, Josh. Appreciate it, man. We'll talk to you soon.
All right, Jeff, take care. Thanks, man.